I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Rob Henderson. He is a psychologist and writer about human nature. Rob grew up in California's foster care system and went on to serve in the US Air Force. He then received his bachelor's degree in psychology at Yale University and his PhD at the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Cambridge Scholar. He's best known for his research on luxury beliefs and social status, which we'll be talking about today. Rob, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
A couple of years ago, you wrote an article titled America's Lost Boys and Me, talking about some of your personal story. What did you mean by Lost Boys?
Yeah, in that article, I wanted to point out the ongoing sort of deteriorating state of a lot of young men, a lot of boys in America. And around that point, there was a big piece in the Wall Street Journal that had come out, indicating that more and more boys were dropping out of high school, college. The gender disparities in college graduation rates continues to grow. I think that article, the Wall Street Journal piece, pointed out that something like 60% of college students are now women, and that this is expected to grow over the next few years. To the point where, essentially 2 out of every 3 college graduates are now women. The number per capita rate of incarceration has climbed. And, some people will, they'll hear that and they'll think about sort of the racial strife in America. But if you just look at white males in America, the per capita rate of incarceration has quintupled since the 1970s. And this is primarily in the bottom socioeconomic strata. So basically, among wealthy white males, the incarceration rate hasn't really budged at all over the last 50 years. But among the bottom 30%, it's multiplied by 5 per capita. So yeah, there's something going on in sort of working class, low income, poor communities, across the country, across all ethnic groups and so on. And so, I wanted to discuss that and link it a little bit with some of my experiences growing up in the foster care system in California, and, discuss how, family formation and stability and parental attention in early childhood can be crucial to ensuring that a kid has a decent life and a decent trajectory. I pointed out, some of the dismal statistics around foster care, around instability, single parent homes, and so on, and how it seems to differentially affect boys in particular. So, like the parental inputs, like how much care and attention kids receive, boys seem to be especially sensitive to it. Such that they're, if they have a 2-parent home especially with a father in the home, they seem to experience, pronounced benefits from that relative to girls. And if there's only one parent, or if they're raised by a grandparent or, someone other than their biological parents, the way that I was, then their likelihood of success is much worse than girls in the same circumstances. And this is something that I noticed too, like when I was growing up, that, none of my male friends in high school went to college. I was the only one who did, but I did it through a sort of a very indirect, it took me a while. I didn't go to college till I was 25. So it took me a little bit to get there, but none of my male friends did. But some of my female friends did. They were in the same circumstances. They were raised by single moms and kind of had that same disordered, environment and upbringing. But some of them did manage to go on to college, and I find that interesting. So anyway, yeah, this is all to say that, the Lost Boys idea was about, what's going on with young males in America.
I'm going to set up 2 extremes, recognizing that the truth must be somewhere in the middle. So on the extreme nurture side, you might say something like, your life outcome, whether you go to college or not, whether you're successful or not, entirely depends on the neighborhood you were raised in. So the advantages or disadvantages you had starting in early childhood. And on the other side, you might say something like genetic determinism. People who succeed despite their disadvantages are just built different. And maybe you are someone who overcame these disadvantages because you got lucky on the genetic lottery, or maybe it's like entirely willpower. And it's an interesting question where those interact. Like, to what extent is something like conscientiousness something that you inherit or something that you can develop over time?
Yeah, it's a good point. I know this is the Nature Nurture
Yeah.
podcast, right? So, yeah, That question is something that I've thought about. So I have a book coming out next year. It's a memoir where I discuss that question quite a bit, trying to, like it's impossible to disentangle all of the forces that make someone who they are, like how my life ended up being this way versus all of my friends and how they ended up in a different way. I mean, it's always going to be both, right? But one thing that I've discussed in some of my essays on Substack, um, there are certain what variables, certain traits that are responsive to environmental inputs, and others that are less so. So something like cognitive ability or academic ability, beyond a sort of basic environmental level. Once the schools are kind of stable, and once you have like basic level of nutrition and sustenance and intention, there's all the research indicates that IQ can't really be modified very much, at least in developed countries. But there are other things like conscientiousness and a lot of the personality traits that are more susceptible to environmental change and variation. I mean, like a simple example, like with IQ, the test-retest correlation across time, that's something like 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, right around that area. But for personality, it's around 0.2 or 0.3. So personality is much more variable over the lifespan than IQ. And I think a lot of that is, some of it is aging and hormones and biology and all of that. But I think a lot of it too is just the kinds of people that you're around when you're old versus when you're young, and the kinds of environments you find yourself in. And so for me, I was always kind of a curious kid. I didn't do well in school. At one point, when I was in the foster homes, I took an IQ test and scored, well below average. And part of that was because I was moving homes every 3 to 6 months, and like, changing schools all the time, foster siblings coming in and out of the home, a very, very chaotic and unstable environment. And so, in that kind of extreme situation, it makes sense maybe that why those tests weren't like indicative of my underlying potential. I mean, this is something that Scott Barry Kaufman, the psychologist, has pointed out, that there are a lot of ways someone might, or like there are a lot of reasons why someone might score low on an IQ test. But if someone scores high, it means they're probably pretty intelligent. But if they score low, it doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. It could also mean that they're in a very severe situation, or they're malnourished, and so on and so forth. And so that's one point. The other is that at least from my point of view, it wasn't really worth it. In that, like, essentially, I think that having a sort of a stable and decent childhood is a good in and itself, and that when we talk about like, oh, kids from these kinds of homes, or low income families, the kids are less likely to graduate college, or more likely to do this, or less likely to do that. I think like that's all good, and it's useful knowledge, but I mean, the real reason why it's bad is because of the subjective phenomenological experience of the child going through it. And so if you ask the kid, like, why are you, and a kid in that environment, like, why are you stressed, or why are you sad, or whatever, they're not going to say like, oh, because, this dropped my likelihood of graduating college by 23% and increased my likelihood of being incarcerated by 15. They're just going to say like I'm sad because like, my parents never pay attention to me, or I'm moving schools all the time, or I don't know, like, if my stepsisters, like all of this stuff is going on around them, drug use, gangs, all of this stuff. And so for me, it's like, we should pay attention to this, not because of we shouldn't be focusing, I should say, on like, oh, are these environmental inputs the reason why kids are doing well or not doing well? It's we should be focusing on how to make their lives better regardless. The other thing, so finally, so in that piece on the Lost Boys, I talk about incarceration rates. So I think that it's probably unlikely for my high school friend group that they were ever going to go to Cambridge or Yale. Even if you had met me at 17, you would have said that about me either. But like, you would have like, yeah, this kid's not going anywhere either. But they probably weren't going to. But I have two out of my 5 friends went to prison. They may not have gone to Yale, but I think if they had had a different kind of life, different childhood, different parents, different home life, they probably wouldn't have gone to prison, right? Like
Hmm.
there is like, there may be a ceiling on your ability, but there's also, kind of a floor on where you might end up depending on your environment. And for them, I don't think that was a sort of a set in stone genetic determinist thing that they were destined to be incarcerated. I think they could have lived a different life, maybe not in the Ivy League, but not also in like the sort of the bottom of society either.
I latched on to the Lost Boys idea because I was something of a lost boy myself. It wasn't as extreme as your circumstances, but I grew up with a single mother. We were poor, and very far removed from the elite academic circles that we currently find ourselves in. And uh, it, I noticed that my behavior as a lost boy was still very different. So in psychology, we have this internalizing versus externalizing symptoms model of psychopathology. So like you could have mental health issues and be depressed or anxious, and you just keep to yourself. And then you could be aggressive, take excess risks, externalizing that way. And it sounds like the from some of your personal experiences you talked about, it was more of an externalizing, like getting into trouble thing. And for me, I just did nothing but play video games. I didn't have friends. I was overweight and overcame my circumstances later by starting to treat life as a video game, like realizing the effort I'm putting in. Some of these online games, like there's a big grind. You have to put a lot of hours into like leveling up or whatever. And yet all of the benefits you're accruing from that effort are virtual. And it suddenly hit me at one point, like, why am I investing time into virtual improvement and not real self-improvement out in the real world? So that was what did it for me. Um, but your story was quite different. You talk about it was the military that helped enforce that like added external structure that helped you improve.
Yeah, I mean, the military is a unique environment because it basically forces you to not screw up your life. I mean, that is a big part of, success. I mean, there are certain things you can do to be successful, but there's a much longer list of maybe things you shouldn't do. And
Mm-hmm.
the military inhibits all of that. I mean, especially early on in training, like basic training, tech school, like all that sort of the first like year or so, every aspect of your existence is tightly controlled. And I mean, you can screw around and do like if you fail a drug test, you can do drugs if you want, but then they're just going to imprison you. Like, it's literally in like the Uniform Code of Military Justice that if you fail a drug test,
Mm-hmm.
like there's some number of like the sentencing for that is like, you go to prison. And so that knowledge of like, oh, like, I can't just screw around and maybe I'll get caught, maybe I won't. Like in the military, you're going to get caught. Like everything is just very cut and dry. Do this happens. And so that was a good environment for me to sort of like get the stability and the structure and the predictability that I lacked as a kid. And yeah, it took me a long time to mature. Like I had to spend those years in that tightly controlled environment and, be around people who were thinking about themselves and their future and those sort of peer group effects. That was really helpful too. And yeah, it's interesting because I don't know how old you are, but I'm guessing you're a few years younger than me at least. And I played some
Mm-hmm.
video games as a kid, but I look at how good video games are now, and I could imagine like if I had been, if I was 16 years old today, seeing like Fortnite or whatever these games are now, like they're so interesting and appealing. I mean, we had the Xbox 360 when I was in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and that was fun, and that was sort of like I think maybe the first console in which like the games were really like pretty close to realistic. The graphics and everything was really really fun, but it didn't like quite permeate the culture the way it has now. Online gaming was
Mm-hmm.
just becoming a thing. Like I don't think Call of Duty and all those games had come out yet. I graduated in 2007, and yeah, that stuff was just kind of taking off. So I'm actually glad in a way that I missed
Right.
the sort of the rise of online gaming. I missed like the smartphones. Like smartphones didn't come out till I was already in my 20s. So I was like 20, 21 when I got my first smartphone. So I'm glad like those formative years, it was like the last era in like American childhood or life or whatever, where like, it was like you didn't spend it on your phone or on a computer. You I mean, I don't know if this is
Uh-huh.
any better, honestly, but like the internalizing versus externalizing of like, trying to like
Yeah.
find a guy in a van to sell you weed or something is like, I don't know if that's better, but in a way it was like more exciting or
Uh-huh.
more interesting or something. So
Yeah,
anyway,
I
yeah.
was going to ask you what predicts whether if you're this lost boy, whether you're going to be the troublemaking type or the type that just sits indoors and is lazy. And I guess it's because it wasn't much of an option if you go back more than
Yeah. There's like,
10 years ago or
environmental
so.
effects, right? Like I think they're probably like just what are your options? What options are available to you? Even something like access to drugs, right? Like the rise in of adolescent opioid addiction is because they have access to it from their children or from their parents' medicine cabinet. Like there was a study on this, I think from 2013 that found this, that this sort of rise in adolescent opioid addiction was simply because kids were going to the medicine cabinet. Oh, here's some opioids. Like that addiction wouldn't have occurred without that kind of access. And so yeah, but there's probably personality trait variables too, right? Like I'm relatively
Mhm.
low on agreeableness and pretty high on openness. And so yeah,
How
I don't
about
know. Maybe it was,
extroversion?
I think I was like the 63rd or something percentile. So,
Okay. Yeah,
slightly
I
higher than
think we share
average.
the disagreeableness and the high openness, but I'm quite introverted.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Introversion probably does, at least among men, probably predicts or males predicts like likelihood of getting into games and those kinds of things. But I mean I like the games too, but they just
Mhm.
weren't as exciting as they are now.
Okay, so you finish your service, you get to Yale, and you experience some culture shock.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean the shift from, being in a relatively conservative environment, conservative not just like politically, but just like culturally, right? Like everyone wears the same uniform to work. If you're a male, you have to have like a very strict hair, like the haircut regulations, everything, right? Like it's just that sort of conformist environment. And Yale was conformist too, but just in a different way. Um, and so yeah, and the other thing is like the kinds of people I grew up around. So I grew up basically like poor to working class, right? Like the town I grew up in, the median household income was $27,000 a year. I think I lived with different families at different times, so it's hard for me to
Mhm.
say like but it was it was not it was around there. And then the military, the like among the enlisted the enlisted group, it's probably like lower middle class is the norm. And then at Yale, there's more students from families in the top 1% of the income scale than the entire bottom 60%. And some of these Ivy League schools, they like to say like, oh, something like half of our students are on financial aid. But most of these rich schools, Yale and Harvard included, I think if your family earns less than $65,000 a year, they give you a full ride scholarship, as an
Yeah.
undergrad at least. And so it's like, oh, your family makes less than $65,000 a year. $65,000 is still above the median income in America. So it's like, basically you're middle class. But a lot of these, oh, I'm on financial aid. It's like you're middle class. Um,
Hmm.
so there was the sort of class shock, and then there was the kind of I guess like the cultural shock, the kind of not just in terms of the income, but just in terms of like discovering the different kinds of lives they had. Again, not just
Hmm.
income, but I've told this story before about how I was in this class once, and the professor administered this anonymous survey, and it was the class was called something like psychopathology of the family or something, right? I was a psych major in undergrad, and so there was an anonymous responses. The professor revealed the results on the PowerPoint slide, and it was out of 20 something students, there were only two that were not raised by both of their birth parents. It was me and one other student. I don't know who it was. And that like floored me. I'm like, wait, because I expected it to be around
Wow.
half maybe. Because for me it was like everyone that I grew up with, the number would have been like 100% of us were not raised by both of our birth parents. But in this
Hmm.
environment, it was like 90 something percent were. And that was the first inkling that I got that like, oh, there's like a family differences, cultural differences, the early life experiences they had, all of this stuff was so different. I mean, part of my shock was like even from like pop culture, right? Like even if you watch movies and TV shows of rich people, there's like divorce and cheating and all this stuff going on there too.
Hmm.
But in actual sort of upper middle class and upper class people's lives, like they get married and they stay married, and very few of them divorce. If you look at the statistics, something like only 10% of college educated women get divorced in their lifetimes, and it's something like 60+% among high school only. So
Wow.
yeah, it's a major sort of class disparity there. And then yeah, that was also when I started to develop this luxury beliefs idea, was shortly after my arrival at Yale. And yeah, I
Hmm.
saw a lot of like student protests and anger, and I was confused by a lot of it. It took me a while to really understand it.
So luxury beliefs, what is that?
Luxury beliefs I define as ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And essentially, there are multiple parts to this, but I've written several essays outlining this idea that in the past, the well-to-do in society demonstrated their status with luxury goods, with their material goods, with top hats and evening gowns and tuxedos and delicate and restrictive clothing, and sort of like visibly you could tell who was rich 100 years ago. If you walk around New York City 100 years ago, you could easily tell who had money and who didn't. Whereas today, it's less true. Luxury goods have become a noisier signal of one's social standing, and so the elites, the affluent members of society, have sort of solved this problem, this desire, because they would like to signal their status. They now do it with their ideological fashions, with holding the right sort of sociocultural, sociopolitical opinions on various issues of the day. And yeah, they demonstrate this by if conventional opinion is X, then they'll show like a sophisticated defense of why of something different, of holding peculiar or bizarre, or clearly clearly the opinions that they learned through having a lot of time. So this is Pierre Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital, of having the time and the means to acquire these sort of esoteric and unusual beliefs that the vast majority of people outside of their circle wouldn't express or adhere to. But the interesting thing about that is that there's often a lot of sort of not necessarily deliberate, but there is some duplicity, because often the beliefs that they espouse, they actually don't adhere to them and their behaviors.
This seems similar to handicapping in the evolutionary sense. For example,
Mm.
a peacock's tail evolves not because it helps with survival, but because it's basically saying, like, even though this costs a bunch of energy and hinders my mobility and makes me more visible to predators, my genes are so good that I can still survive this handicap. And it's like a sexy fitness indicator despite its handicap. Is a luxury belief more similar to that than it is something like, I don't know, you gain genuine knowledge like about advanced physics or something, and you can write off these equations that no one else can understand, and because that could equally be a way of showing your intellectual status, right? But we don't tend to do that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, both economics and biology have used these signaling models, and so yeah, I've discussed both of these. I mean, yeah, that's the peacock example is a good one. And then yeah, in economics, and Pierre Bourdieu, he was a sociologist, but economists have sort of used his work as a launch pad for these sort of economic ideas around social signaling. And yeah, if you buy a really expensive car, there is a handicapping component to it. You're saying, I'm so rich that I can afford to expend vast amount of resources on a car that I probably don't need, that doesn't get me from point A to point B any better than a Ford Focus or something would. But I can
Mm-hmm.
expend all this money to get it, and it impresses people. It sort of lets people know where you stand in society. And so yeah, there is this sort of costly signaling, maybe a self-handicapping idea to it, but I don't know if it's if it's self-handicapping in the sense that like you're not like evading predators or something the way that stotting or large peacock tails would, but they are luxury beliefs are honest indicators, I would say. Some people have said like, well, luxury beliefs aren't they, if you're just expressing opinions, this is kind of a cheap signal. And I agree that like saying words is cheap, but saying them in the right way, in the right order, using the right terminology, having the vocabulary, knowing what the issues are and how you should respond to them, that does take time. It takes careful study. It takes the ability to, like read the fashionable periodicals, the right op-eds, the right podcasts, hold the right kind of education and so forth to like be able to communicate in that way. And that is an indicator. It's a costly signal of sort of underlying access to resources and education and knowledge.
It's dependent on time and how much it sets you apart from what the general public believes, right? You recently wrote an example about this with the term homelessness, which is now moving towards like the unhoused, which might be the luxury way of saying it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a perfect example of it. It's you're starting. I mean, this is a good example because you're slowly starting to see this shift where a lot of educated people are. I think they're still uncertain which word is the right one. And so I've heard people kind of like they say homeless and then they say, well, homeless or unhoused, or they'll say unhoused or homeless. Like they're trying to like communicate that I don't know if this is what everyone's saying, but I also don't want to be offensive, and so I'm just going to use both. And yeah, using this term unhoused is a way of indicating like, yeah, I listen to NPR and read the New York Times and listen, and am around other people who care about social issues. And it confers status on them, but I think like the amount of time that people spend updating language and definitions, and like Steven Pinker calls this the language treadmill, the euphemism treadmill of like, you're constantly changing the words, but focusing on that doesn't actually like benefit. It doesn't materially benefit people who are actually homeless, right? If you go up to a homeless person and say, hey, I got good news, you're unhoused, you're not homeless, he's going to be like, oh, like, thanks. Like, I had a friend, so I mentioned earlier, I had a friend who was in prison a couple of years ago. I texted him and I texted him, hey, you're I have good news for you. You're not what did I say? You're not an ex-con anymore. You're not a criminal anymore. You're a justice involved person. And he was like, first he was like, what I don't know if you can swear on this podcast. He's like, what are you talking about? And I told him like, hey, like this is what people are saying now. And he made some joke about like you and your Yale friends, whatever. And then he said, I have news for you. You're not a, what did he say? You're not a college graduate anymore. You're a classroom involved person. And so the point is that like justice involved person doesn't help people like my friend, doesn't help anyone who's actually involved in the justice system, but it does sort of make people look compassionate and sophisticated and interesting and educated and so forth. So
because once upon a time, maybe like 30, 40 years ago, homeless itself was the new term that only academics were using to be like more PC, right? And then it caught on, and the idea is now if you're using the term that's caught on, you can no longer distinguish yourself, so you need a new term, and that's the treadmill that keeps repeating itself.
Yeah. I mean, we can predict that in some number of years, unhoused will be considered an offensive term, and that they'll come up with some newfangled way to communicate that people are like that they're homeless. So it's a lot of sort of useless energy to sort of demonstrate what's standing, but doesn't help anyone.
So it's one thing for a luxury belief to emerge as a status indicator to set yourself apart, but why do they so quickly become moralized? So it's not just unhoused is the term that showcases that I'm in the right circles. There's also this element of, and if you're using the old term, this is offensive and this is like a moral error.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. I mean, I think a lot of that is just, sort of status concerns. I think that there is this the person who came up with this idea, the name escapes me, but the general idea is that, there's always like a certain amount of morality in a community, and that people will always sort of invoke morality to sort of justify themselves or to raise their own status or to undermine others. And nowadays, like a lot of conventional morality is seen as passé or it's seen as old fashioned or hokey or something. And so now I think a lot of these newfangled vocabulary, all this stuff, it's just like another way to sort of invoke your own status, to raise it, to undermine others, because you can't really do it in other ways anymore, right? Like you can't accuse people of whatever, like the conventional moral violations of like being a thief or being I don't know, aggressive or something. So yeah, there's just like a new way to do it. I don't think all luxury beliefs have to be moralized. Though I mean some of them aren't. I think like promoting technology is I've used this example of like there's a growing number of people who are becoming aware of like the dangers of smartphone addiction and all this stuff. And I know there's some debate about it, but a lot of people in tech who are selling this and promoting the wonders of all of this advanced technology, they don't allow screens in their home. They send their kids off to these special schools where the kids use pencil and paper. And meanwhile, like the LA County school system, I think they gave every kid an iPad. And
I was one
from
of the
my
first test schools in LA to be part of that program. Yeah. And it was a disaster.
yeah,
People were just watching
yeah,
YouTube or playing games in class.
yeah, yeah, of course. Like, yeah, the people who develop this technology, they know how appealing it can be, especially to young kids, unformed minds. Like, why would you possibly be doing math on your iPad when you can watch videos and play games and stuff? So yeah, I think that's kind of a luxury belief too, like espousing the wonders of technology, but meanwhile you're kind of a Luddite or an ascetic or something at home. And I don't think that's necessarily moralized, but a lot of the beliefs are.
In your view, is this an unconscious process, or are people aware that they're trying to do these like one up people with their beliefs?
I think most of it is probably unconscious. I read this article in the New Yorker recently, which said that basically cultural capital, it manifests in different ways. So 100 years ago, if you could speak Latin, this was an indicator that you were a member of the educated class. You went to an expensive, esteemed university. But if you spoke to, if you went up to someone 100 years ago and said, like, why do you speak Latin? They're not going to say, like, oh, it's because, I want to show that I'm better than other people or that I'm smarter or whatever. They might say that because to demonstrate their education or something. But I think, they learned it sincerely. They thought that it was a valuable thing that they were doing. And I think that's probably true for most luxury beliefs today. Right. I mean, the example the New Yorker gave, it said, in 100 years ago, that's how they did it. And today, it's if you can, quote, like, queer a work of literature, that's an indicator of capital today. I don't know if that's better than learning Latin, but that is an expression of cultural capital in the modern age. And I think most people, it's probably unconscious. It's kind of implicit. People just naturally do things that win the esteem and approval of their peers, and tend to avoid things that elicit scorn. So I think a lot of the behaviors that we do for status seeking reasons are mostly unconscious. It's a natural. I think it's a natural behavior, but I try to make it explicit and draw it out, because the people who are the most responsible for shaping and influencing culture, I just they should. I think they have a responsibility to think more about the sort of downstream second order effects of the beliefs that they promote and espouse, and yeah.
Some status signalers or historical luxuries, you mentioned like clothing and technology, they've fallen out of fashion amongst the elites because now they're pretty accessible to everyone. But others, like learning Latin, you could still very much argue that it takes a lot of time and money and investment to do that, but no one would really care. So why do some fall out of fashion if they remain reliable indicators?
Well, because you don't get status for it anymore. I mean, if you can speak Latin, a few people might be impressed,
Mm-hmm.
but no one's going to confer any kind of accolades or praise on you. But if you if you champion the latest, if you start saying unhoused instead of homeless, or what was the other one? Was this I see the USC flag. Was this at the USC school about changing fieldwork to practicum?
I
I
haven't heard
think
of
that was
that.
like,
It could
yeah,
be
yeah.
though.
Well, they said that fieldwork has, racist connotations, so they changed it to practicum. I think it was the School of Social Work. Yeah. So anyway,
Mm.
like, using those kinds of terms, I don't know, like, basically people will respect you, admire you, or whatever, if you do that, if you change language, then if you
Uh-huh.
can do these sort of, speak Latin, or do physics. You mentioned physics earlier. Some people
Right.
might be impressed, but I think broadly speaking now, that's not how people obtain
Uh-huh.
status.
Okay, so here's another hypothesis here then, because if you look at old academic writing, especially in philosophy, like every third sentence includes a Latin phrase, and it's like just this very pretentious style of writing. And it seems like everyone's in the club and they learn the phrases that most people won't understand. And now you can probably moralize that. You can say, like, this is exclusionary. So if you take what's still a luxury phrase, it's only used in a certain academic circle, but technically the word is plain English, then there's plausible deniability to it. So it's like you might not know the lingo, but it's not like it's literally in a different language. So you can't say that it's much harder to make an argument that this is an exclusionary practice.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I see what you're saying there. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there is that sort of delicate balancing act there, and then I think there is a duplicity there too, because a lot of these beliefs, a lot of, the holding the correct opinions, they are exclusionary. They just don't realize it. I mean, yeah, like all of this, the language, the sort of euphemism treadmill, holding the right views. I mean, they are exclusionary in that, like, if you are not a member of these circles, if you didn't have a parent who went to college, if you're not exposed to this stuff on a regular basis, yeah, you're much more likely to say, express the quote unquote wrong opinion or something, and you will be excluded. So yeah, maybe you can't speak, maybe you can't speak Latin, and you're not being excluded by that basis, but you used the wrong word, or you expressed the wrong opinion about this ongoing issue. It was you were supposed to say this 6 months ago, but now you're supposed to say that. A couple of years ago you were supposed to support defunding the police, and now you're supposed to say reform the police. Like, these are exclusionary. It's just yeah, many of them just don't realize it.
The second key part of your definition, beliefs that also confer harms upon lower status people. These harms, the like language-based exclusionary ones, those don't seem really harmful, but there are others like monogamy you write a lot about that
Hmm.
do have like more real harms that you can measure over time. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what do you want me to just, discuss, or you want to start somewhere in
Yeah, let's
particular,
let's
or?
overview. Maybe you could even start. You mentioned encountering this and this being one of the first at Yale, and this being
Hmm.
one of the first things that sparked that original idea of luxury beliefs.
Hmm.
If you want to just tell the story.
Yeah. I mean, so there was this young woman I knew from Yale. She said, basically, we're having a conversation about, relationships and, career and all this stuff. And she said, she thought that marriage and monogamy were outdated, and that, we should sort of, move beyond them. And this to me, this was a novel this is a novel view that I hadn't heard much about before. And I asked her, what she meant. And then I asked her, like, do you plan on getting, like, what do you want to do in your future? And she's like, well, I'll probably get married, and I'll probably, settle down and have a family. But just because I'm doing it doesn't mean like everyone should do it, or that it's for everyone, or, like, and she said, like, it's just the institution itself is grounded in patriarchy and so forth. And then I asked her, well, how did you grow up? And, what was your family situation like? And she said, yeah, I grew up with my parents, and, my mom and my dad, and so on. And so she, and then she went to Yale, and she went on to law school, and now she's a very successful person. And so she benefited from this sort of, this ancient practice, and she plans on conferring the same benefits to her own children. But her official public position is that people shouldn't do this. despite the fact that she received the benefits and that she plans on giving it to her own children later. And so that got me interested in this possibility that maybe the belief that marriage and monogamy are outdated or should be downplayed, or that we should move beyond them. This may be a luxury belief. And but now I've shared a lot of data on this, indicating that if you look at family structures in America, in 1960, for example, both upper class and working class families, 95% of children in upper class and working class families in 1960 were raised by both of their birth parents. So, class was not a predictor at all for a kid for what kind of family structure they had. But if you fast forward to 2005, for the upper class, it dropped to 85%. So it was 95%, and then it took a slight dip down to 85%. But for working class families, it went from 95% and plummeted down to 30%, such that now if you go to low income communities in America, you'd be hard pressed to find any kids really raised by their mom and their dad. Oftentimes it's single parents, or maybe like step families, or maybe multiple step families, if their parent have been sort of divorced. And sometimes it's not even step, it's just the mom has a boyfriend who's living with them, and sometimes he's just the dad for a year or two, and then the mom, they break up and move on. Sometimes they're raised by their grandparents. I had friends who were raised by their grandparents too. So I mean, yeah, it's but the thing is that the people who are the most sort of vocal and adamant that the institution should be outdated, or the institution is outdated and should be dismantled, are the very people who are the most likely to get married and the least likely to get divorced. I mean, that was the sort of the common opinion, at least the most sort of common vocal opinion that I saw. Maybe there are a lot of people who do believe in monogamy in marriage, but they're just more restrained. They withhold this opinion. I've told this story before. A friend of mine, he goes to another university, but he said that when he sets his dating app radius to just around the university, so 18 to 22-year-old women around the university, it was he said that something like a third of the bios, if you read the bio, it says things like poly or casual or open to anything or whatever. And then when he extended the radius to include the outskirts of the university, which is a more sort of blue collar area, he said about half the women were single moms. And so poly and open relationships and complete sexual freedom looks very different depending on the kind of class that you're in and the kind of people that you're around. And yeah, this has detrimental effects on young children. And I think people often overlook kids. Kids are, they can't vote, they don't have much power, they're like Marx would say, they're a class in themselves, but are not a class for themselves. They can't sort of unite and demonstrate on behalf of their own political interests. So, kids often get overlooked, but they're the ones who suffer a lot, and women too suffer a lot from these kinds of arrangements. But yeah, marriage and monogamy, they're still widely practiced among educated people, and far less so among the less educated.
And the idea is that those shifts over time were causal, like the luxury belief might emerge within academia or certain elite circles, and then over time it shifts the culture, and then it's those at the bottom of the socioeconomic rung who are most impacted by that cultural shift.
Right. Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, so if you're a smart, educated, conscientious person, and you're in an environment where the norms are unclear, you're better equipped to answer questions like, how do I live a fulfilling life? What steps should I take to find meaning and success? And what kind of family should I form to ensure that my kids are set up for success themselves? And so up until 60, 70 years ago, everyone just sort of followed the same cultural life script of marriage, monogamy, getting married, having kids, and that kind of structure. But then once the norms were undermined and loosened by primarily educated people, college educated people who were sort of upper middle class and above, that same group, they were well equipped to answer those questions, but then the people for who are less academically able, less conscientious, and so forth, um, without the sort of cultural life scripts, the guardrails, the sort of strong norms, they're more likely to slip into situations where they may have kids out of wedlock, that they didn't plan or intend to, or maybe well, for young men in particular, I mean, a lot of young guys, when there are strong sort of social norms around them, to find a partner, to get married and settle down, they'll do that. But in the absence of that, like, the game for men from like 17 to until they're physically no longer able, is to just like, let's see how many women I can have sex with and betray as quickly as possible.
Mm.
And so you see a lot of that. I mean, you see that in colleges and in sort of educated circles too, like men behaving very poorly. But in lower income communities, like it's often even more pronounced, and the women there, suffer the most for it, and the children too. So yeah, it's yeah, again, like sexual freedom looks different depending on the environment that you're in, the class that you're in. And yeah, so the sort of the norms that were undermined sort of loosened restrictions, and now you do have more freedom. David Brooks wrote this article in the Atlantic, I think last year, and it was something like, if you wanted to summarize the last 60 years of American life, you would say something like, like life for adults has gotten better and life for children has gotten worse. I don't know if I completely agree with that life for adults has gotten better, but it has gotten freer. Like, adults do have more options. And maybe that's better. But for children, life has inarguably gotten worse.
I think there's something to that. I had never met anyone seriously advocating for polyamory before I got to Harvard. So it does seem like to be this
Not
luxury
even at
thing.
USC?
Not at USC, but like I said, I
Oh,
was more
okay.
introverted and I
Okay.
came more out of my shell more recently.
Okay. All
But
right.
well, also at USC, I think this is the key difference actually. At USC, this was undergrad, so everyone is just on Tinder and
Hmm.
messing around. But at Harvard here, these are older grad students I'm talking to. They are in a relationship, but it's a polyamorous relationship. So at USC, just no one thought about commitment at all, really. And then here, it's like
Yeah.
we're committed, but we're also sexually free and open.
Yeah. I see. I
At
see.
USC, when I was on Tinder, I noticed something interesting. So I would get my matches at a certain level of attractiveness. And then if I went outside the college bubble, like if I was swiping in another town or something, um, physically, my matches would be much more attractive. But these were students, or these were girls who weren't going to school or just weren't doing that much with their lives. And how I interpreted that was something like, to them, it was more attractive that, like, I'm going to USC and that's like a big status signal. So it boosted my attractiveness relative to what it is at USC, where like this is something everyone has. So it's almost canceled out.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, of course. Like that's yeah, the school, I mean, like I was at Yale, right? And I saw this too. And you probably now, at Harvard, I'm sure if you were on Tinder, you kind of see a similar kind of pattern of like different matches based on, how impressed the girls might be by where you go to school. Yeah, there was a study uh I think 2019, which found that, yeah, this was not like the brand name of the school, but rather whether a man had a master's degree versus a bachelor's degree, and the master's degree
Mm-hmm.
got like twice as many matches. Um, so yeah, that's interesting. So only at Harvard
Yeah.
did you hear about? Well, I mean, only like Yale was the first time I heard about polyamory. I mean,
Yeah.
this is like these universities are the sort of center of what, I don't know what you want to call it, sort of unique sexual positions, and yeah, that they will, they start there, and then they write about them in popular media outlets, and then it's sort of depicted in pop culture and in movies and TV shows, and then eventually, right, like eventually, like low income communities are going to be like, oh, let's try this poly thing, and then it's going to look
Mm-hmm.
different. It's going to look different for them if like a woman has three boyfriends in Cambridge, Massachusetts, versus if a woman has three boyfriends, like where I grew up in Red Bluff, California. The kind of experience that woman's going to have in her children, it's going to look much different.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of interesting evolutionary dynamics at play with our mating psychology here. One thing you
Mhm.
might think is that the natural drive, especially for men, might be just go impregnate as many people as possible, have as many offspring as possible, and then it's only society and culture that constrains us with monogamy. But we know there's also evolutionary reasons for pair bonding to emerge.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the those both. I think that the way that people are attempting to thread that needle is through poly, right? Like you have this
Mm-hmm.
sort of pair bond, you have this main partner, and if you're if you're a male in that situation, like I would love to, like I don't know if anyone's done date like research on poly couples, but I would love to see uh the like number of attempts each partner has made to hook up with a side partner, like and then how and then just generally like the number of partners that they successfully hook up with. I mean, I don't know what I would predict for well, for attempts. I would imagine that the male, like
Uh-huh.
in heterosexual poly couples, the male's going to just try more often to have
Yeah,
side
I would think
partners.
more attempts for males, but higher
Yeah.
success rate relative to number of attempts for females.
Yeah, exactly. But then in terms of like overall number of side partners, yeah, maybe it would balance out, or just because just the fact that the male's trying so much, he may be able to get a few, and then the woman, probably can more easily obtain a side partner. Um, and then also just my guess is that like a lot of these poly situations, it's just like the guy who wants to wants to cheat without it being cheating.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so yeah, like the pair bonding thing is yeah, I mean you can, it's a strong evolutionary impulse, I think. But we sort of have these opposing feelings, and I think the pair bond often becomes more pronounced, right, when couples have children.
Right.
Part of the pair bonding mechanism is like decrease in testosterone among men, like men who have a stable monogamous partner, their testosterone tends to decline, and then once they have children, it tends to decline even more, and that just keeps them sort of even more committed and less interested in being aggressive and sexually
Hmm.
interested in other partners.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's like right now you're seeing yeah, a lot more, I think, of the pair bonding being what, like less prevalent.
I recently did a podcast with Sue Carter. She's a neuroendocrinologist, and she did a lot of the seminal work on oxytocin's role in pair bonding in prairie voles. Are you familiar with any of that?
Yeah, I've seen some of that work.
So one thing that surprised me in that conversation is that so prairie voles are monogamous. Uh, Once they mate, uh, they'll partner with their first mate, generally partner for life. They'll raise the children together. They'll cuddle together. Sue Carter showed that all of this is oxytocin based. So if you give them drugs, oxytocin blockers, the pair bond won't form, even if they have
Mm,
sex and even if they're exposed to each other in exactly the same way. Uh, but later with DNA testing, so this was back in the 80s before DNA testing was invented. When it was invented in the 90s, they found out that the prairie vole fathers who were monogamously paired, like in a single family unit and raising these children, they weren't all fathers of the offspring that they were taking care of. So that
mm,
means that some percentage of the vole females were like sneaking off and finding a mate. Uh, and so basically, they were socially monogamous. It was almost like they were married to and living with their first sexual partner, but then they were sometimes getting impregnated with others. So they were basically poly, like they had a pair bond, but they were sexually free. And
mm.
some of the people I was talking to about this with the poly people I met at Harvard, they were arguing for it almost on evolutionary lines. Like they were
Oh,
saying
interesting.
all of the benefits for it that you get, that all of the benefits of pair bonding that you get can be achieved if it's merely social monogamy, but sexual monogamy is unwarranted, they said. And I wasn't sure what to make of that. I mean, obviously, you have something like jealousy, which is an evolved impulse against sexual freedom in a paired partnership. What do you think of that?
I mean, like if like basically, I think if you're like an adult and you're not trying to push your lifestyle on other people, whatever. But I think like once kids are involved, I mean, there's just like inarguable evidence, like this is consistent, that when children
Mhm.
live in a household with adults that aren't their birth parents, they're anywhere from, well, I mean, like some evidence suggests like they're 8 times more likely to be abused. Some suggest like 10 times more likely to be, physically abused, and much more likely to be emotionally abused. Um, they're more likely to be like killed by a step parent, especially a stepfather. uh Mother's boyfriends are often like a serious threat that pose to the child. And again, like if you're like if you're like the if the poly like if the polycule is made up of like a bunch of Harvard grads, and some of them have kids, there's probably like not a lot of overt physical abuse going on, although I could imagine there
Right.
would be some neglect or some emotional abuse maybe.
And
But
I should
if
add that
yeah.
it does seem like it's a luxury belief in the sense that none of them are seriously considering this to be like a proper life strategy once they get married and have kids. They were all saying like,
Oh, right.
I'm planning to be monogamous once I have kids. This is just for my 20s. So that's like
Yeah.
only possible now that we have contraception. So like
Yeah.
before that, it would never have been possible.
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if they, yeah, I mean, if this belief spreads, then yeah, it'll be much more detrimental, I think, for
Hmm.
for other communities. And it's interesting that they're arguing on evolutionary grounds because, you like, I mean, I'm imagining a lot of these people are probably smart. They're aware of like the naturalistic fallacy, and trying to draw morality from evolution is very fraught business, because there's a lot of ugly things that happen among animals that you would never try to justify on evolutionary grounds for human behavior. Like hostility and aggression and mate guarding, and like, if you look at how like male chimpanzees treat female chimpanzees, you'd never see like, oh, like this is what they do, so we should do it too. um yeah, that's yeah. And the
Yeah.
jealousy thing, I heard this story. There was an entrepreneur, CEO, something like that. He told this story on a podcast about how he was trying this poly or open relationship thing, and he like, it was a very like kind of gut-wrenching story of how he said he was like in a bathroom, and in the room next door, or the room like, between them, he could hear his wife hooking up with another man. And he said he like felt this intense jealousy and nausea overcome him, and he was like retching, throwing up in the toilet. And he was just like overcome with like just the idea of someone doing this with his wife. And he was telling himself he just had to push through this. Like there was something pathologically wrong with him. Like, you shouldn't be feeling jealous about this. That's not natural. There's something wrong with you. Why would you be jealous? It's like, it's pathetic, and so on and so forth. Trying to fight his own bodily reaction to what he was hearing. uh and so it's like, I don't know, that doesn't sound like a pleasant
Yeah,
experience.
it
Maybe
does
there are
seem
some guys
like
who
a
can do
very
it, but
natural response. Although,
yeah.
interestingly, one of the girls I was talking to about this with, she said that when she gets jealous, it's actually a turn on for her because she's saying, like, oh, well, it would be a bigger problem if I wasn't getting jealous because that would mean I don't care. So it's like the fact that I get jealous means that this, like, almost in proportion to my amount of jealousy is how much I care about this person. And then she was saying it was a combination of that realization and then the idea of like, this social monogamy, like, yeah, but I'm the main his main girl, so suck it, basically.
I
She
wonder, like, I think that a lot of this like may go back to our earlier conversation about disparities in higher education, and just generally among like successful people, among like, people like sort of look at the top, the top rung of the social and economic ladder in society, and it's overwhelmingly male, mostly old, aging out. In 20 years things are going to change pretty quickly. um but at the moment, if you look at people like under 35 who are like educated, on a promising track in terms of their careers, and so on, like there's a lopsided gap where there's more women than men. And I think a lot of the
Mhm.
poly casual stuff, like a lot of it is just a cope. It's just like people trying to like navigate an environment in which there are fewer and fewer sexually romantically desirable men. And
Right.
so, yeah, this is like a way for them to deal with that, where a lot of guys are just having like multiple girlfriends. And
Right.
I think there's like I'd also like to see that too, that data. I mean, it seems obvious to me that it would be like most of the poly relationships, it's a
Mhm.
man with multiple girlfriends, because just generally like the research shows that they're more interested in variety. So like how many polycules are made up of like men with multiple female partners versus women with multiple male partners?
Right.
um
Because
and
people are going to match based on status. So if
mhm,
way of measuring status is university education and 60% are female, moving towards 2/3, that's a 2-to-1 ratio. So you're just
yeah,
expecting like women will either be forced to put up with a relation to either compete for one man, and then there's going to be like the other third of women who are left out, or to do some sort of poly like 2-to-1 thing, or to downgrade their standards so they're not getting a university educated man. And it seems
yeah,
like poly out of those three options is looking like a better option for a lot of
yeah.
women.
I think that's right. I mean, there was a great line. I think this was in How the Mind Works, where Pinker says something like most women would rather share John F. Kennedy than have Bobo the Clown all to themselves.
Yeah.
Um, and that was like the '90s when he wrote that, but so the reference is maybe slightly outdated. But like the idea is like, yeah, I think most women would rather share, I don't know, Channing Tatum or whoever the hot male equivalent is today, versus like some unattractive mediocre guy. And so yeah, this is like a sort
Uh-huh.
of an interesting consequence of the Lost Boys phenomenon.
Right. Well, I guess if you're looking at it through evolutionary lines, the dream from the female perspective would be something like share that high value male for one night, get impregnated, but then pair bond with someone else to take care of the child. So that would be like cuckolding.
Yeah, although that strategy doesn't seem to be like supported. I guess like that was the kind of the cuckolding strategy in evolutionary psychology. There was a lot of debate, contentious discussion around it. But I think now the idea is that actually didn't happen very often. And so
Mhm.
now I think there's the like, converging evidence on the mate switching hypothesis that women actually would like they would really rather have a high status male all to themselves. Like they would like the genes from the male, they'd like his care, his attention, and so forth. And yeah, there's like research on this about like the vast majority of women who have marital affairs, I guess like the cuckolding hypothesis would be like, they would go sleep with some rock star and then like have their mediocre husband and his resources or something to take care of it. But actually most women fall in love with their affair partners. Like women who have affairs, something like 70% of them fall in love with their affair partners, compared with men where it's only about 30%. Most women cheat because they're unhappy with their husbands, but most men who cheat are not actually unhappy with their wives. um and so yeah, it seems like women really do want the male. They would rather not have to like have like to be someone's like, even if you're the main girl. Like I don't think most women enjoy the idea of like,
Mhm.
oh, this high status man that I really like is gonna go hook up with someone else, and then they do the intellectual acrobatics of, oh
Mhm.
well, I'm jealous, so that means they care about it. Like, can't you just care? Do you need to like test it by feeling jealous? Like that to me doesn't sound like a completely healthy situation.
That's very interesting. Okay, so it sounds like you could make an argument, a rational argument for like why this is okay in your 20s while you have contraception, but then later we should all gravitate towards monogamy for the sake of the kids. But then the downside to that is if you have a whole society of people just being poly in their 20s or hooking up casually in their 20s, then there's going to be a non-insignificant portion of those who like get pregnant and become single mothers, and it'll just degrade the norm of fatherhood, and that'll be harmful for many future generations of our children.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a lot of like behaviors and practices that educated and affluent people can engage in and not suffer the same level of consequence. They have the sort of access to resources and social capital and all these things that even like not only they're more equipped to experiment with novel relationship arrangements, but even if they make a mistake, it looks very different for them than it does for someone in a low income environment, in a low income community, who, you know, like, is just in a much more unstable situation. Like, they can't practice those same set of behaviors, and so if those behaviors become promoted and normalized, you know, it's just a much, yeah, it just looks much different. And so, yeah, but I think a lot of people, you know, who if they make choices they are not entirely certain are right, it becomes much more important for them to push these choices on other people and to get other people to agree with it, because they need to sort of like justify it to themselves that they're doing the right thing. So they have to, like, you know, get other people to get on board with it.
Oh, that's very Freudian.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
there's a
I guess
Freudian element
if
to
you
it.
were if you got pregnant and you wanted to keep the child and you were destined to become a single mother, if you were wealthy, you could still care for that child very well. But then if you were a struggling single mother, it'd be much more difficult. Although,
Yeah.
interestingly, you mentioned um, town you grew up in, median income of 27,000. I think that's that's less than most PhD students make, at least if you're at a private school. And
Yeah.
PhD students here are complaining that we're not paid enough, and maybe relative to uh, the opportunity cost of someone doing the same, like, very technical job, especially like if you have good coding or statistical abilities doing research, then you could probably get paid way more in industry. But they use very extreme language. They say like this wage is unlivable. And growing up with my mom, like, she made less than I do now as a PhD student to support us both. So
Yeah.
it does go back to that idea of, like, I don't know, something like culture shock, like realizing that I have a very different perspective on money than a lot of my peers.
Yeah. Yeah, that is I mean, I heard those kinds of, yeah, I heard those kinds of opinions too. And yeah, for me it was often infuriating, because yeah, it was the same situation. Like, I understand that, like, relative to many of your peers who go on into tech or consulting or finance, you're not earning, you know, you're not earning the same amount, but you are earning like a livable wage. People live on this wage all the time. Like, the, you know, the custodian who cleans the halls of Harvard is living on that wage, but you can't. Like, why do you think that just because, you know, you have a fancy degree, like you're a student there, you get to, I don't know. The whole thing
Right.
is just
And he's
very
more likely to have
irritating.
kids and a family to support with
Yeah,
that
yeah.
wage.
Somehow he's doing
Yeah.
it, but you know, because you know, most of the people who complain about this, I would imagine, grew up relatively well off. So for them,
Mhm.
you know, they just think there's an entitlement there.
We talked about not wanting to commit the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something was evolved doesn't mean it's morally right. But we also
Mhm.
know that there were evolutionary forces shaping our moral cognition. Uh, I find it fascinating, like some game theory models, for example, like a game like tit for tat, where it can turn out to be the most mathematically optimal strategy to play in something that looks like fairness, but of course it's just the AI, like, converging on whatever is maximizing payoff. So that seems to be one example where the two are one and the same. Like, what you evolve towards and what the moral norms become are both maximizing, like, some payoff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's it's hard, right? Like, to I guess, like, evolution and those kinds of models and the research, it kind of shows what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, like, trying to ground your morality in any of those, like, oh, like, this tit for tat model shows this, like, then therefore this is what you should do. Like, maybe if that's what you want to do, if that's what you think like a good way to live is, then sure. But it's not like, I think it can inform your morality, but I don't think you can, like, necessarily base it on on that entirely. I mean, you know, because I mean, you could see, like, I mean, you can, yeah, you can see, like, where that might go wrong too, where some
Mm-hmm.
models suggest, like, behaving in a very selfish way or something, like the dictator game, right? Like, there's no reason you should give money to the other person, and, like, often, like, most people do give some money, and they, you know, they have to actually, like, override like their natural instinct to keep the money. And there's some funny I don't know if this is replicated, but, you know, the research a few years ago about how, you know, economics majors, like students who were economics majors, were more stingy, more selfish in economic games, because they had learned, right, like, oh, the rational actor model is to not, you know, to basically be selfish, because that's how you're supposed to be. And so, the individual payoff is good for them, but I don't know if like, you want to, if like that's the best way to base your sort of, personal ethics.
Because a lot of these economic games are like one-offs where the rational option wouldn't be sustainable in a repeated game. So dictator game you mentioned, that's the one where you are told like you can have $10 and split it with a person however you want, but if they reject it, you both get nothing. And then if you say,
Mhm.
okay, like I keep 9 and they get 1, for the other person, it's like, hey, it's a free dollar. If you throw it away, you both get nothing. So you might as well accept the dollar. But it's almost
Mhm.
like a pride thing. You'd rather say, screw you, I'm not a person you can just give like such unfair treatment to, probably with the idea that if they did accept it, and if it is someone that you're going to have repeated interactions with, you don't want to come off as a pushover.
So that's the ultimatum game.
Okay.
The dictator game is like it's even more simple than that. It's like, here, you have $10. Do you want to give Adam any of it? And like it's just, do I give him any? And most people, I think like the average amount people give something like a third, like something like 30% ish in the dictator game, which is stunning. Like, why would you give anything at all? But yeah, if apparently if you're an economics major, you kind of learn about these things, then you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't have to give anything. Okay,
Right.
like no,
But I
that's
guess
that's
if you're a
the
psychologist, you might give
yeah.
more because you're thinking along the lines of, oh, what I do in this game is basically signaling something about me. And again, if it's
Yeah.
someone you're going to see again in your life, you probably want to treat them right, just for the sake of reciprocity, even if you're purely selfish.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So and that is like yeah, we evolved in these small tight-knit communities where reputation was extremely valuable. And so yeah, I mean like in some of my own research, I used do you know the cyberball paradigm? Do you
No.
know this? Like it's a very simple online interactive game. You basically want to elicit social rejection and the negative feelings associated with that. And it's just you're playing an online ball game, like a ball tossing game with two other players on a computer screen. And in the inclusion condition, you just you're passing the ball regularly to the other two players. You're interacting, you're passing the ball back and forth with them. And in the exclusion condition, you're completely excluded from the game. I think you get tossed the ball once in the beginning, and then for the remainder of the game, you're just sitting there watching these other two players toss the ball back and forth. Like massive effect sizes in terms of like people's like thwarted self-esteem and reduced feelings of meaning and all this stuff. And it's like it's silly. It's like a 2-minute game.
Mhm.
But yeah, this is like taps into like our evolved need to belong and like ostracism and exclusion and reputation, all of those things. We're so sensitive to it that even in these like online interactive games with two strangers can elicit such strong negative emotions in people. Like I didn't believe it was going to work. Like I've seen like there's so much research on using that game, and psychology, there's some replication issues. And so like, is this really going to work
Mhm.
for my studies? And it worked. Like it was amazing to me that it elicited that much sort of negative emotion in people.
Wow.
So anyway, yeah, I'll just say that like yeah, I don't know, like using evolutionary models for morality. Yeah, I don't know.
You mentioned that you're currently working on a book. Is there anything you
Yeah.
want to plug before we wrap up?
I mean, you can go to my Substack, robkhenderson.substack.com. You can follow me on Twitter at robkhenderson. Yeah, the book will be out spring next year. It's yeah, it's a memoir, and it sort of delves deeper into some of my personal experiences, but there's a lot of social and cultural commentary, some of the stuff you and I have been discussing, luxury beliefs and observations around class and status too.
Thank you very much for your time, Rob.
Thanks, Adam.